Okay, so every year without fail, I get a number of students asking if it's possible to set up the labs at home so they can practice. And the answer is yes, but there are a couple of gotchas. First of all, we're working with Windows 2008 R2, which is a 64-bit operating system. So you need to have 64-bit hardware at home to run this. And you also need enough horsepower, say memory, CPU, to run a couple of virtual machines. I'm going to recommend at least 6 GB of memory on your computer, if not more than that, but at least 6. Now, with that stuff out of the way, you're also going to need a copy of the operating systems, which I have stored on my computer in this folder called ISO. And I have a copy of Windows 7 and a copy of Windows 2008 R2. And some people like to use DVDs. I'm not a big fan of DVDs. They're hard to keep up with. They scratch really easy. And I found that ISO files work better for me. An ISO file is simply a digital representation of a DVD. And store those on your computer. Keep up with where you stored them. If you don't have any ISOs, we have some in class, and you can copy them onto a flash drive or something. So I'm going to minimize that. You're also going to need Oracle VM VirtualBox or some kind of a hypervisor. This hypervisor happens to be free. Now the one we use in class is a version of VMware, but it's a licensed version and you have to pay for that license. Oracle VM VirtualBox is free. So just go out and Google VirtualBox and grab you a copy of that and install it. And once you install it and open it up, you're going to see something like this. Now, I have no virtual machines installed right now. So we're going to set one up. Here's the new button. We're going to press the new button, and that gives us a window and asks us for a name for that virtual machine. Now, this is just something you can recognize the virtual machine itself by. I'm going to call it Demo 1. You can call it whatever you want. The type here is Microsoft Windows, and the version is 2008 R2, which they don't have R2, they have 2008, 32, or 64. The R2 version of 2008 is only 64-bit. So we're going to choose that one. And next. Ask you about memory size. So how much memory do I want to throw at this virtual machine? The minimum for 2008 R2 is 512. I'm going to go with 1024 just because I want a little bit better performance out of it. Next on that. Now it asks us if we want to create a virtual hard drive. A virtual hard disk drive is simply a file that the machine is going to look at as a hard disk. So I'm going to leave that at create and press the button there. And now it asks what type of hard disk file for that virtual hard drive, and the default VDI is okay. So press next. And what kind of virtual hard drive? Do we want to have a dynamically allocated as far as the size goes, or a fixed size? And the difference here is, let's say I want the virtual machine to have a 30 GB hard disk, so I set 30 gigs. If I choose the first option, that hard disk file is going to be very, very small, and as I start using it and storing things in it, the virtual disk file will grow according to whatever I'm doing with it, and it will grow up to the maximum size of that 30 gigs that I set. Now, because it has to grow on the fly, you take a small performance hit for that. Whereas fixed size, that hard disk file will take up the entire 30 gigs on your host machine's storage. Now, since it doesn't have to grow on the fly, the access to it is faster. So you do not suffer the performance hit. Instead, you suffer the storage hit on your host machine. I'm going to choose the dynamically allocated version and press the next button. The name of the virtual disk file, I'm going to leave at the default, and I'm going to change this 25 gigabytes to a 30 gigabytes. This is the size the virtual machine will see the hard disk as. So I'm going to press create, and that's going to create a base virtual machine for me. Now I can go in and change the settings that I need for this virtual machine to make it for our purposes. So I'm going to press the settings button. And the first setting I'm going to change is in the system category here. And it has to do with boot order. Now, this boot order is very similar to the boot order on your own computer's BIOS. It's going to look at these items for boot files in this order. The first thing it will look for boot files is a floppy disk drive. Well, I don't have a floppy disk in my machine. I'm going to untick that, and I want it out of my way, so I'm going to press this down arrow button to get it out of the way. The next thing it will look for boot files on is a DVD or a CD. And then finally it will look at a hard disk for boot files. This would be perfectly fine. I'm going to have an ISO file associated as a DVD. It'll find that in the list, and it will it'll boot from the CD. But let's think about that for a second. When I first install Windows, that's perfect. It'll find the CD boot files, boot to the installation, and I'll run my installation and finally install Windows. Now, after I install Windows, it's going to reboot. And when it reboots, it's going to go through this same list again. And it's going to find the CD first. And then it's going to ask me, press any key to boot from the CD or DVD. And I have to wait that out before it finally moves on and goes to my hard disk, finds the boot files for the Windows installation, and boots me into Windows. Now, that's kind of annoying for me. I don't like to wait for that press any key to boot from CD. So what I'm going to do here is move the CD below the hard disk. I know that seems kind of counterproductive right now, but hear me out. Whenever I turn this machine on for the first time, it's going to go and look for boot files on the hard disk. The hard disk is going to be empty. So it's going to move on to the next thing in the list and find the boot files for the DVD. It's going to find the installation disk, and it's going to boot into the installation. I will be able to install Windows and finish up. Now, after restarting from installing Windows, we're going to come back through this list, and it's going to hit the hard disk and look for boot files, and it's going to find the boot files for Windows and boot me straight into Windows without asking me to press any key for any kind of CD boot. So that's where I'm going to leave this as far as boot order. Now the next section I want to mess with here is the storage section. Now I mentioned earlier that I don't like to use DVDs for Windows. Instead, I use the ISO files. Now, if we look here, we have the VDI file, which is the hard disk file. If we click on that, we can see some specifics over here. Now, the virtual size is 30 gigs. This is what the operating system is going to see. This is what the virtual machine is going to see as a disk. The actual size that it takes up on my host storage is only 2 megabytes. That's that dynamically allocated storage we were talking about earlier. Now, if we look up here under IDE controller, this is our virtual DVD drive. And we can look at the attributes over here, and if we press this icon here, the CD icon, we can set what this virtual CD drive will be doing. If I had a real honest-to-goodness DVD of Windows, I could tell this machine to look at whatever disk drive, whatever CD drive I inserted that DVD. I don't have one. Instead, I have an ISO file. So I'm going to choose a virtual disk file. And when I do that, I want to navigate to the folder where I store my ISOs, and I'm going to choose the appropriate one from the list. In this case, it's going to be 2008 R2. So here's that. I want to choose that and press open, and that will associate that ISO file with the DVD drive. Now, this is the equivalent of popping a DVD into the drive and leaving it there. Okay. Now, the last section I am going to make changes to is the network section. And this is kind of optional for you. The reason I make changes to this section is in our classroom environment, we set up DHCP servers and Active Directory servers and things like that, especially the DHCP servers. DHCP servers work on broadcasts, so they send packets out across the entire network and everybody can hear them. Well, the default network setting for the network card is something called NAT. Now, without getting too far into networking class, what NAT does is allows that virtual machine to not only talk to other virtual machines contained in VirtualBox, but it also allows that virtual machine to talk on the real live physical network and further on out to the internet. That would be okay if we were running a production environment and the machines needed to talk on the physical network. It's what you see a lot. But in our lab environment, when we're setting up 20 different DHCP servers in the same room on the same Ethernet links, we end up with broadcast storms and someone's virtual machine grabbing DHCP broadcasts from somebody else's virtual machine. So you end up with this confusing situation of broadcast packets going all over the place. So to prevent that from happening, what I do is choose internal network. And this gives us a virtual switch to which to attach all of our virtual machines. And the way this works is any machines on the same virtual switch can talk to each other, assuming the IP addressing is set correctly. The way we set them on the same virtual switch is by giving them the same internal network name. In this case, I'm using the name Acme. So any other virtual machines that I set on the internal network name of Acme are plugged to the same virtual switch and they can talk to each other. Now what they cannot do is talk on the physical network where everything is plugged in, all the hosts are plugged in. So we don't end up with those broadcast storms we had with the NAT selection. Now I'm going to open the advanced section and just make sure my cable connected checkbox is selected, otherwise we end up with network cables unplugged messages in our virtual machines and nothing can talk. So a quick recap of our settings. Under the system, I associated or I changed the boot order to what I wanted here. Under the storage, I associated our ISO file with the DVD drive, and the network section I changed to internal network and gave it a name of Acme. Okay, and that should be all the changes you have to make to the virtual machines to get them ready for our purposes. Now, you would use the same method to set up the other virtual machines to mirror what we have in our lab environment for your class, whether you're in server 1 or server 2. Setting up the virtual machine for the Windows 7 box is exactly the same, except for you might choose different values for memory, and you might choose the different ISO file to reflect Windows 7. So as always, if you have any questions on this, if you have problems, feel free to contact me. My contact info is in the syllabus, and we will see you next time.